Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's webinar. A few housekeeping things before we get started. We will try to get to any questions that you may have at the end of the presentation. If you do have a question, please type it into the question area in the GoToWebinar navigation, and we'll get to as many as we can in our allotted time. One continuing education credit, or CEC, will be emailed to all participants on the live version, and a link to a recorded version of today's webinar will also be available within that email. You should receive the CEC email and link within the next 3 to 4 days. With that, I'd like to turn it over to our ACSM moderator, Dr. Jamie Cooper, Associate Professor and Graduate Coordinator at the University of Georgia. Dr. Cooper?
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Dr. Jamie Cooper, and on behalf of the American College of Sports Medicine, I want to welcome you to this webinar titled Nutritional Myths and Practices of the Elite Athlete, Implications for Active Non-Elite Performance. Our co-sponsors today, the ACSM and Ag Nutrition Center, have a strong relationship that is built on providing the best and most useful information to individuals participating in nutrition, exercise, and training programs. ACSM is the largest sports medicine and exercise science organization in the world. With more than 50,000 members and certified professionals worldwide, ACSM is dedicated to advancing and integrating scientific research to provide educational and practical applications of exercise science and sports medicine. ENC is a credible source of nutrition and health science information and the acknowledged leader in research and education related to eggs. ENC's nutrition health experts also monitor scientific findings and regulatory development and serve as a resource for health practitioners and fitness professionals needing current nutrition information to share with their patients and clients. Today's webinar presenter is Dave Ellis. Dave is the president of Sports Alliance Incorporated and the first president of the Collegiate and Professional Sports Dietitians Association. With over 30 years of experience working with top athletes in numerous collegiate and professional teams, Dave is widely recognized as one of the key influencers in the world of sports nutrition and an innovator for his training table designs and approach to body composition and frame assessment of athletes. A dedicated educator, Dave speaks regularly at various health and nutrition conferences and blogs on a variety of sports nutrition-related issues. It is with great pleasure that I present to you Dave Ellis.
Thank you very much. And just a quick note on the Collegiate and Professional Sports Dietitians Association. This group's worked really hard to raise the bar on the number of teams that have access to consulting or a full-time sports RD or registered dietitian to really go in there and advocate for the welfare of these athletes. And some of the milestones so far is for this young organization is getting the NC2A feeding rules deregulated in 2014, and we've got many more initiatives that we're working on right now, whether it's with NC2A or NFL or MLB. We're at a lot of tables on the advocacy front, and we're going to be talking about high performance, tenets of high performance today, and some of the fact and fiction that's going on out there at all levels of sport. But I got to tell you, before there were high performance directors, there were coaches like a guy named Tom Osborne in Nebraska that saw the value in fueling. And when I left Nebraska in 2001, before going private, after 20 years at the collegiate ranks, I had a staff, full-time registered dietitian assistant and grad students, and we had full control over that training table. And in addition to the normal strength conditioning and sports medicine pieces, Tom had a vision for fueling. And a guy named George Sullivan, the old athletic trainer that is now retired, sent me to my first ACSM meeting probably in '88 or so, where they taught me how to do skin folds, and that was one of my first responsibilities on the way up the ladder, was taking over the longitudinal assessment of body composition. So we've always looked at ACSM as a great resource, and all of you should be aware of the nutrition and athletic performance position stand. I think they built that with data from 2006 to 2014. It's a great basis of information for trying to build best practices. But I got to tell you, best practices are very circumstantial, and they're very rapidly evolving in nature. So today I'm going to talk a lot about what's going on in those circumstantial settings under high performance directors who really I got to, we'll look at all high-performance directors could operate with evidence-based research for every decision that they made. That would be great. But the nature of high-performance athletics, at the tip of the spear of sports, is a lot of forward-based conjecture. We're trying to figure out answers to things that we don't have the evidence-based research to validate, that literally seems to be happening with a lot of commonality in practice. And so there's one of the big differences between high-performance tip of the spear sports for elite athletes versus the general public is the risk-taking that goes on in sorting some of those issues out. And high-performance directors are trying to do it in a sound fashion, in a safe fashion, but nonetheless, they're pushing for small incremental gains as far as their insights that solve problems and improve performance. And it's just those small marginal gains that happen on a continuous basis that really might make the difference between winning and losing at the highest levels of sport. So I'm just going to pull out some of the highlights of the position stand from ACSM on sports nutrition. Certainly in the world of high performance, the availability of the athletes on game day because they're not injured or sick is huge. So there's a big immune piece to what we can do as sports RDs to help make sure these athletes are properly fueled and ready to perform. One of the terms you're going to hear now is unexplained underperformance syndrome, as a lot of that's going on in this immune space, and there's a good paper cited there. There's certainly a lot going on that we can do on the energy availability. Certainly these high-performance directors expect us to have a plan for the hardest training days versus the inactive days, and to have this fueling periodized, and certainly to take advantage of strategies that allow these athletes to go in there and do more work at a training session. So there's some timing issues there, and certainly recovery and readiness to train or compete are very big issues. What have we done to personalize plans based on body weight or fat mass and fat-free mass to dial in their fueling plan versus just using generalized guidelines? So you've got to know what you're doing with regard to body composition assessment. It's a very volatile topic that we'll talk about. And I'll tell you, nobody's going to recover from their training if you're way off course with regard to meeting the unique cultural demands and the diversity of these rosters of many of the teams that we work with. So there's a lot we have to be good at, and making sure that they'll use the food supply we've got around because it's dialed in is a very big deal. So I've always tried to simplify fueling down to 3 steps: less downtime, more energy, faster recovery. It's a simple 3-step approach that athletes can engage with, that literally when we organize the food and training tables to represent each of those 3 steps, we can make every meal a learning opportunity, an educational opportunity, and a chance to observe how the athletes are using the food supply, and as far as using it appropriately as an individual relative to their active or inactive days when they're around us as a team. Now, as far as the energy availability piece is concerned, the periodization, we have to teach athletes that there are some foods that they have more latitude to upregulate on active days, and by the same token, they may need to downregulate their sugar, starch, and fat intake relative to inactivity. And whether they're eating with us in a training table environment or they're eating on their own, it's very critical that they understand that their appetites may not adjust as quickly as the changes in their metabolic demand of their day. And so they have to be conscious about this. And if they're active 6 out of 7 days in the week, maybe it's no big deal what they do on the 7th, but there are some athletes that were not dealt the same hand metabolically or more vulnerable, and we've got 2 or 3 days off in a week. They better be able to throttle down their sugar, starch, and fat intake, their non-protein calories relative to inactivity. And as far as the pattern that they're eating, the timing of meals, the timing of snacks, we try to keep them in a routine, but based on practice and travel and competition, we're always manipulating these patterns to fit the duty cycle of the day. And so there's not written in stone, and there's definitely a lot of changes that go on here based on what we have to conform to. When it comes to personalizing these diets, believe me, it's our highest minute emotional leaders on the court or the field or the ice or whatever that are absolutely the most vulnerable if they miss a meal, if their pattern is askew in any fashion. And so there's just a very low margin for error that we better have this thing dialed in. Certainly we need to dial in their protein requirements relative to the amount of fat-free mass they've got. So that's why I like to get a body composition assessment with a reliable tool. We'll talk about that in a little bit. And then based on the feedback we're getting that we know the minutes they're taking in practice or competition, come up with an active day feed rate versus an inactive day where we're manipulating those sugar, starch, and fat calories, those non-protein calories, up or down. And one thing that really disturbs me I want to bring up is that we've got a lot of athletes who maybe don't stick around in the off season at the pro level. They're from all over the planet. They mobilize to compete on a pro roster here in the U.S. and they come back from these breaks and their feed rates have maybe been dialed in below the minimum level that we would expect them to be able to get by on an inactive day in an effort in the off season to maybe mobilize body fat. And they've maybe successfully done that, but they're reluctant to go back into an active day fueling pattern. And of course, that creates a lot of vulnerability on the performance or injury front. And if it goes on too long, of course, there can even be bone demineralization. And that's not just unique to women. That can happen in males also, and a whole lot of hormonal dysregulation. So this is not, even though historically that's maybe been a bigger issue, this restricting relative to activity for female athletes, we see it in males too. And it's an odd thing to have to take an athlete out of that guru off-season, get lean mode, and take them back into a in-season fueling pattern that's going to help them get the job done. So body composition assessment is a big deal. If you don't do it right, you can certainly not give an athlete credit for the success they've had in the off-season with their training. Might cost them money at the pro level with regard to fines. We're certainly not going to have the metabolic prescription correct if we don't know with some accuracy fat versus fat-free mass. And so we might use a head-to-toe assessment like a DEXA on tables that are wide and long enough for athletes. But in between, we've got to have something non-invasive, something better than skin folds. Right now, we're taking a look at ultrasound as a way to look at fat pad changes in between our test dates from head to toe on a DEXA. And so you got to know what you're doing here. And if you're working with a young, maturing population, the high-performance director is probably going to want you to be smart about knowing, like in an Olympic developmental setting, what the realities are for an athlete as far as making changes in body composition depending on where they're at in this maturity continuum. Certainly when they're coming off of their most rapid vertical growth is where we've got a very great opportunity for them to start really responding to their resistance training and accruing lean mass and net body weight if that's a goal. And so they expect us as sports RDs to be on top of all this and even help them understand whether they're early bloomers or average or late bloomers, depending on where that curve falls, so that because we're tracking growth. And beyond tracking vertical growth, okay, we have to track some other metrics maybe that can help us figure out weight carrying capacity. So sitting height, like length of trunk, or the breadth of their pelvis and hips, the breadth of their shoulders, the depth of their chest. All of these characteristics that can kind of define the robust characteristics of somebody's frame might explain why all these athletes being the same height, we have a weight variance of 185 to 205, 285 to 325, right? And so we're trying to advocate for these athletes that they're trying to do something that's within the realm of reality for their frame. And I'll promise you that some of these bigger frames also have a lot greater vulnerability for body fat and visceral body fat and carrying more body fat. And so not everybody's dealt the same hand there, and there's something a little bit characteristic going on with their frames. And I'll also add that as athletes get older, they tend to play, like on a pro roster, they tend to want to play lighter. They may not have the body fat to lose, but they want to even play with less muscle just because they have a bad orthopedic story going on in ankles, knees, hips, or lower back. And so we have to start taking a look at, what could we can potentially do for an aging, orthopedically challenged roster at the pro ranks. And one of the things we're going to be following here is, is there anything dietarily that we can do that keeps connective tissue from getting so stiff and vulnerable to injury that it becomes rate limiting and they fall off these rosters. So advanced glycation end products are something we'll watch as I'd like to see some more data here to support it, but at the end of the day, there's a little bit of data to show that a high advanced glycation end product diet could end up having a stiffening effect on connective tissue. And maybe that's one thing we can start to intervene on earlier with people that have a history of a lot of orthopedic injuries. As far as game day fueling is concerned, these high-performance directors certainly expect us to feed these athletes in a way that isn't going to leave them in a fog leading up to the start of the competition, team meetings, where there's some critical messaging going on, or to have a food supply that's in the back of their throat when they're out there at the start or during the early part of the competition. And so that's a very fundamental thing that we've got to be on top of. But there's a lot going on that they're going to expect us to be on top of with regard to contingencies for hydration on hot, humid days, or competing at altitude, or for cramp mitigation if it's an athlete with a cramping history, certainly early in the season. Maybe even something for the coaches at the neurological level as far as their ability to make good decisions and be alert and not overreactive. And so dietary supplements come into play, and not all of these interventions, functional foods and dietary supplements, could be solutions here, where I wish we had a lot of time to talk about that subject because it's a popular one, but I'll just warn you that we're supposed to be one of the main checks and balances to bringing in credible solutions in this space for our athletes and coaches that could in no way harm them, and hopefully are all certified to be free of any kind of active pharmaceutical ingredient that could cause a positive doping outcome. So that's a very big responsibility that they expect us to play. As far as that pre-game fueling is concerned, I'm typically going to only use lean sources of protein pre-game, about 3 to 4 hours out is a real safe margin, versus higher fat proteins. Carbs are going to be slower digesting in nature because they're going to get hungry by the time we get to the game and compete. I actually want a little bit of a time release story here rather than just a bunch of desserts that are higher glycemic in nature. When we get to the locker room, certainly we're going to have a lot of very high glycemic, fast digesting, low fiber carbohydrate sources around. And about the only thing we really worry about out of the first step, the fresh produce step, the immune step, is just highly spiced foods. We're not going to feed them anything pre-game that could be really highly spiced in nature and cause a problem. As far as the high-performance directors are concerned, there's a lot more they're going to expect out of us on game day. These folks are really into their analytics. They're trying to figure out why coaches are doing what they're doing, whether it's really happening or there's another reason for it. Analytics is a big deal. Guys like Troy Flanagan are leading the way here in North America. He used to be at US Ski and Snowboard. Now he's at the Milwaukee Bucks. And guys, analytics are going on in the front office of organizations where they're trying to monitor fan experience. There's certainly the personnel people are using analytics to figure out the shelf life on these athletes. People like Troy are certainly trying to figure out from a loading standpoint in their training facilities, exertionally or external loads, monitoring with a number of different technologies, the quality and the quantity of the work that they're doing as a team and as individuals, so that they do it in a smarter fashion. They can bring them to multiple peaks, and that these athletes along the way, they don't wear one of them out that's a difference maker and can't be available on game day. The dietitians, we're not so much involved in that external load monitoring. We're certainly getting that information. The dietitian there at Milwaukee Bucks now is Sean Zell, and he may certainly monitor who's doing the most work, taking the most reps, and who's fatiguing early, so that he can have a strategy with regard to fueling. But they're probably leaning on the sports RDs in the high-performance world to be in on the internal loading side of it, like to monitor some of the metabolic characteristics of that athlete, while the high-performance folks are certainly into this, but they're really also, a lot of them are really drawn to that external loading story. And so, this is, a lot of different ways we can monitor internal load. But ultimately, the key tenets of precision medicine are also what we're using to help provide that internal load story back to this high-performance team. So let's just kind of pick away at different areas here. Environmentally, they certainly, we've always been monitoring urine concentration to figure out whether these athletes are hydrated going into competition. There's some biosensor tattoo-type materials that are coming, It'll tell us a lot about sweat composition, rate, and maybe some of the metabolites as to whether who's fatiguing earlier that we can cross-validate with that external load. So we got to be on top of this story. That ultimately gives us a chance to customize the intervention for the athlete or even change it during the course of their training if we're getting something real-time feedback from a biosensor. It's great to see the sports drink companies out there getting on top of this, giving us some variability for different kinds of sweaters. Maybe we can even spot somebody who, from that internal metabolic story, is fatiguing earlier than usual and break out some kind of a acute intervention when they've done too much too quick. And might be an issue of depth on the depth chart where they got over-repped, our offense is doing bad, our defense is stuck out there, and we don't have the depth to sub people in and out. That creates a perturbation that we probably better have some contingency for. This one is just a bunch of soluble sodium citrate and bicarbonate that we can get from a non-aspirin thing like Alka-Seltzer that's very soluble, and we can gavage these buffered solutions into these athletes on an as-need basis. It'd sure be great to be able to do that proactively versus waiting for them to start to cramp or fasciculate there and then trying to solve the problem after the fact. They're certainly going to expect us to use tools to track their total calorie intake and make sure these tanks are topped off leading into competitions. So we're only going to see them eat so many of their meals, and then we're going to try to get a quantification of what's going on away from us as a team. So we use some very simple tools there that are available to everyone, and anybody can have access to something like that. One of the big challenges that we've got is, of course, trying to get them out of binge eating patterns where they're not eating enough early and too much late, and we don't have a very smart metabolic profile going on here that might set them up for some vulnerability. It's like really kind of hard to get these athletes, if they're stuck with some body fat, to mobilize that fat when they have binge eating patterns. So we're always trying to move some of those binge calories from the PM towards the AM, so we have more of a robust and even response over the course of the day as far as being in a fed anabolic state. And this is probably pretty important for Joe Public too, right, as far as maintaining metabolic flexibility and giving them a chance to utilize their own body fat as an energy source more effectively. And so there's data out there to support that, but that's good for everybody. In fact, something just came out this morning that high phenylalanine protein sources may have a satiety benefit. So it's a combination maybe of using a good protein distribution over the course of the day from something that's essential amino acid rich from a quality standpoint for muscle and metabolic rate, and then something that for specifically high in phenylalanine like eggs to blunt their appetite, and that would be a winner for metabolic flexibility, mobilizing body fat. Now, as far as athletes are concerned, they're eating a lot frequently, right? Breakfast, lunch, protein calories, something incidental to the training for recovery, dinner, and of course, kind of the new thing now is a protein snack before bed. Data is pretty new here, this chronobiological story on feeding before bed. Athletes always ate before bed, so I think if anything, we're just trying to get efficient here about what we could do in a timed release fashion. It gives us a little bit of a recovery advantage at night that we had not been strategic about. Normally, we're just worried about them overeating something that's so heavy before bed that they won't eat breakfast, and then we've got a binge pattern starting the next day. So all this is more frequent feeding in an anabolic fed state has just got a good muscle recovery, protein synthesis story going on for athletes. Interesting, Joe Public is probably sitting back sometimes, not training with any consistency, not feeding this often, and they're even looking at fasting and time-restricted feeding patterns that might be a fraction of what an athlete would consume during the day. So we're probably not going to fool with anything like that in season. But in the off-season, I can't rule out for an athlete who's showing some kind of insulin resistance and vulnerabilities to experiment with something like that. But I don't think it's a very good in-season strategy. As far as the personalized fueling strategies, let's just talk about protein for time's sake today. A LeBron James-sized human being might be about 258 pounds, 7% body fat, maybe 240 pounds of fat-free mass. When I'm basing a feed rate of protein on just their fat-free mass versus their total body weight, I usually draw the line at about 1 gram of protein per pound of fat-free mass. That'd be about 240 grams per day. If you do it based on body weight, the feed rate might be pretty close, about 232 pounds. LeBron's a pretty lean example, and subsequently he would not be too far off either way you approached it. But when you start dealing with somebody like an offensive lineman and you're doing your protein feed rate calculations based on total body weight, you could over-protein feed the amount of fat mass they've got on those frames. So I'm not so sure I think that's more of a general public thing, doing body weight, because they just don't have the capacity to get accurate fat-free mass readings from something like a DEXA unit. And then so you can go and calculate based on fat-free mass how much essential amino acid they need in one serving. Nothing straight essential amino acid, so we typically double that number to an actual minimum protein serving that they might take in if you did it based on body weight. Again, not too far off in a lean example like this. And then we kind of apply those between meal minimum protein intake strategies, take the number of grams of protein times the frequency of those intakes between meals, quantify it, subtract it out of total protein requirements, divide it over the number of meals you've got, and apply it. And that's maybe how I would go about doing a very personalized approach to when I had fat-free mass and fat mass broken out on an athlete at an elite level. And of course, most people will just use body weight as an approach to come up with their protein distribution, spreading it out. And then there's certainly data out there that supports maybe a 15 to 25 or 20 to 30 gram for everybody minimum protein serving versus calculating it. I think I struggle with that a little bit. It's probably not wrong, but at the end of the day, from gymnasts to lineman-sized human beings out there that we deal with in any given athletic department, there's probably a smarter way to go about doing it. And when we have body composition data, we ought to do it. As far as the quality of protein sources, especially at those between meal snacks or post-workout, I think we're certainly looking for something with a good anabolic response. And so high milligrams of leucine per gram, or in this case per ounce of protein, this is how they rank out. This is why you'll find these protein sources in most of your functional foods or dietary supplements designed for consumption post-workout. They're just extraordinarily high leucine yielding protein sources per volume consumed. And subsequently are the most expensive ones where there's a global demand and there's wild volatility in the market for those. Jumping around, let's look at the genomic side of this thing. Talent identification. Talent identification is something that the high-performance folks working with young populations might be trying to do to, find a tiebreaker on young talent that they're going to invest their time in and move up the developmental food chain. There's certainly some genetic profiles where you go out there and figure out what they're most suited for that you could use as a tiebreaker. At the pro level, believe me, they have them so well scouted, this is probably the last thing they're going to worry about. Genetically, for sure, we could go in there and figure out whether there are certain nutrients that they may have elevated requirements and feed rates on, or that we need to lower their consumption on, but we're still going to have to cross-validate it with some blood work. The genetic part also comes in handy with all the fashion versus function going on with gluten restriction to figure out whether somebody really needs to restrict or that maybe they just have some degree of vulnerability for a sensitivity. And as far as the Zenbiotic story is concerned, this is a pretty interesting area. We've got a lot going on that could show up in food from a spoilage standpoint, adulteration for economic gain in fortified functional foods, or straight up active pharmaceutical ingredient adulteration for codependency and dietary supplements that these high performance folks are expecting us to mitigate through a food and supplement security role for these teams. So I'll just tell you that there are a lot of laws, there's a lot of regulations out there for the supplement industry that come with the GMP regulations that could give them a positive adulteration ranking if FDA comes in and inspects them. The problem is maybe 3% of the registered manufacturing facilities per year get inspected, but when they do, they find a lot of problems. And it's not just adulteration. That 70% rate of violations could be from the supply chain through finished product, anywhere in between, that could give you an adulteration positive. And be aware, there are certainly some bad actors out there that probably do necessitate examination of some more stringent laws. I would say, first and foremost, people that are going to intentionally adulterate with active pharmaceutical ingredients to stimulate codependence that could cause a positive doping outcome in our athletic populations and health problems, that keep throwing more and more products at the market because they're making so much money that they can just deal with all the fines levied against them. They shouldn't be able to add second and third and fourth and fifth products to the market without pre-market approval at their own expense. And that's a law that should change. And probably categorically, we've got some areas where adulteration is just happening in so many categories, where stimulants and weight loss or pre-workout, anabolic agents and muscle building or recovery products, on and on and on. Joint health, attention focus. FDA catches a couple people per week and puts it up on their website, but it's just out of control. Like, I can't imagine, and maybe in some of these categories we're probably seeing 30% of the products out there at retail that could be adulterated and haven't been identified yet. So U.S. Anti-Doping is working with people like Department of Defense to go out and proactively test products and identify the ones that are doped. They'll name the brand, the product, and the adulterant that's in there. That's great for us health professionals to be able to understand what we might see in the top of these athletes' lockers and kind of police it. Because if they're doping one product, probably I'm not going to give them any leeway on any other products from that same manufacturer. And, there needs to be more participation here with regard to the resources for Supplement 411, U.S. Anti-Doping, to proactively get out there in this sports destination, the supplement space, and do this testing. We've just taken it on our own recognizance as Sports RDs to not bring anything in that we would fund or supply at the team level that isn't NSF certified, or where they've gone in and looked at 240 plus doping analytes. They've gone in and GMP inspected the facilities, so they're not just doing a trust verification over the phone to see if they're doing anything in those facilities that could cause cross-contamination. It's a very buttoned-up program. If an athlete wants to shop for anything outside of what we're funding and supplying at a team, we want them to use the NSF app to do that. And there's not a locker room that we go into where the tops of these lockers are not littered with products that quite often when we sit down with the athlete and start talking to them about what they've got, they'll pull out 6, 7, 8 products and say, look, a relative gave me these, a buddy gave them to me, they just showed up in the mail, and yet they've got them in the top of their locker. So that is exactly what the supplement industry wants, is to create a validation through these athletes, permeate across the locker room if it's a high performer on the team, to get others to use it. And certainly if they're doing interviews in front of their locker, that's a way to create credibility for a product, and quite often the athletes just have got it up there because it just, without ever really doing their homework on whether it was of value or not. And I think Joe Consumer out there is a little vulnerable. Obviously, they're going to maybe look up there and think if it's good for them, it's good for them too. Something else that we're trying to, that isn't a doping agent, but is really a bad story, are these endocrine disrupting chemicals that can make it into our food supply and from a number of environmental sources. They're showing up in dietary supplements, and some of them express a real estrogenic response. So at the end of the day, it's kind of strange that the supplement industry usually is all about avoiding anything that has anything to do with, muscle, at least on the muscle building front, with estrogen, and yet some of these endocrine disruptors that might make it in through the food supply, into the food supply through number of different exposures. The ones in yellow here are the most common that we're trying to deal with as Sports RDs to mitigate. But they can be environmental too from a number of sources, and it's just a bad story. Just recently, the annual health cost burden is about $340 billion in the U.S. alone. And neurological conditions are the biggest problem because these things love fatty tissue, and so spinal cord and brain and reproductive organs where there's more fat are destinations for these endocrine disruptors. And things like flame retardants seem to be some of the biggest problems that are out there. And I wish I had more time to talk about that because it's a bad story. In fact, it's showing up over here on the gut health, the microbiome story, these embiotics, these endocrine disruptors. So this is an area of very high vulnerability for the next 10 years. It's exciting. It's going to change the way we do business with regard to all that we can intervene with on behalf of an athlete to balance out the microbiome and the taxa here. The diversity is what we want without it being skewed one way or the other too much. We certainly know there are dietary stories that can impact this, but there are certainly stories where some of these endocrine disruptors can alter that diversity of the microbiome and cause problems with gut motility and gut barrier issues. And so just recently, it's not just an endocrine disruptor story. There are food additives like emulsifiers that have been identified to be a problem with regard to the diversity of the microbiome. Certainly the packaged foods tend to have more of these emulsifiers in them, and it'd be a double negative if the packaging itself was a way of introducing endocrine disruptors into the food stuff along with the emulsifiers. That would be a double negative as far as something we'd be trying to avoid. And a triple negative would be if the food in that portion control package had been pre-processed and there was a upregulation of gram-negative bacteria that's got a name now, pathogen-associated molecular patterns, PAMPs. And bottom line is here, this has got a pro-inflammatory story. It's not a good story at all. We're talking about kicking up something like lipopolysaccharide that's used in research studies to cause inflammation when they want to create a model like that. And it's why we've always fought as registered dietitians working in sports for fresh food, to have the real facility, the real qualified personnel, the real operational budget to feed fresh food. And yet people operating on a shoestring are not going to do that. And this is maybe where we're going to have an advantage at the highest levels of sport, where we can do this right, versus somebody who operationally can barely afford to have a shake station for their athletes. And there's really no structured training table, and the athletes are living hand to mouth. And of course, these same compounds that I just identified can cause havoc with regard to tight junction barrier, that leaky gut story. Most Americans seem to think that everything that goes wrong with their lower GI tract has got something to do with gluten intake. And those high-performance directors are going to expect us, when we're training athletes under the most invasive phases of training or competition, to potentially have on the left here something that we can do proactively to tighten that junction, that barrier up, decrease the vulnerability versus the exposures that are over here to the right that might make it worse. And sadly, all of the aforementioned issues could be obesogens, metabolic disruptors, and that these could increase the number or size of fat cells directly from like endocrine disruptor exposure, or indirectly through some kind of a problem with regard to dysbiosis down in that microbiome. And this has certainly got our attention. I think if the tracking data out there for obesity went beyond gender, race and gender, they would probably, and they could quantify endocrine disruptor exposure, they might be able to tease out why some of the athletes that we know are training hard and we've got good structure on their feeding, at least when they're around the team, are non-responders, that they really just do not mobilize their body fat like they should. And we're starting to wonder whether there is a maladaptation story that might come a little bit from these endocrine disruptor exposures. So that's going to take some time to tease out. All we can do for now is teach athletes about all the different things they and maybe their significant others can do to mitigate some of these exposures. And some of them are a little more pricey than others, like eating organic is not going to be something everybody can afford to do. So I can't go into all the detail for time here, but the ones in the yellow are probably a little more focused on what the dietitian can do to try to educate and mitigate. As far as the things that are going on that athletes are falling prey to, along with the general public. The fashionable elimination of foods like that may be gluten containing. That's a tough one to swallow for all of us that have been around for a few decades, because there was a time when athletes just didn't seem to think that this was something. It was a very small percentage, let me put it like that truly had a reason to eliminate something like gluten. That maybe 1 out of 133 that truly have diagnosed celiac disease. Maybe 1 out of 14 might have a legitimate story on a non-celiac gluten sensitivity or wheat allergy. But the symptoms are all the same, it seems as though, and so there's a lot of confusion. Right now, well-controlled studies where they've taken a look at the big three, where there might be a legitimate reason to eliminate gluten. About 86% of the people that say they are eliminating gluten didn't really have a reason to do it at all. So it's with that in mind, that there's got to be something going on that's beyond the fashion that has people doing this for what they think is a functional reason. But nonetheless, we're still trying to figure that out, because it's still trending up here in 2016, about 6% annual growth on this gluten restriction story. 2013, though, look at this, 81% growth in this area. I mean, looking back, I'm not sure what it could be, but certainly in the U.S., it seems like, popular press, the right spin and the right daytime TV show might be a real catalyst here. And when you compare it across outside of the U.S., they just don't seem to be as vulnerable. You take the entire former EU with UK and Europe, combine them together, and the U.S. has outpaced them on gluten-free consumption. So we must just be maybe a little more vulnerable to the fashion versus function. And ultimately, when group speak becomes group think, you're up against something, right? You're up against something, and so there are, a lot of unnecessary elimination diets that seem to be packaged along with training philosophies and programs that there's almost a social reinforcement to adhere to. And if you go from Skittles and beer to let's say a paleo diet, and you've got the reinforcement of the group to train and to make changes that are paleo, that are fit to the paleo philosophy, then that's going to end up being a reinforcement that you kind of continue. Unfortunately, some people are continuing the elimination well beyond maybe the elimination diet du jour into very detailed deep dives that just consume them daily on what it is that they're going to eliminate. That's actually got a name, orthorexia. It's not so much body mass driven like normal most eating disorders, a body dissatisfaction or a desire to be lighter. It's just really all centered around food perfectionism that results in a lot of elimination. And of course, lots of elimination could be a problem with regard to that microbiome and the dysbiosis. So there's always been a vulnerability with low polyphenol intake and fiber intake for dysbiosis or antibiotic use, but I think we're worried about these elimination diets being yet another catalyst for dysbiosis. So the whole microbiome story, you can see, is something that we're using as a new measure for concern on a number of fronts, and we're certainly looking for a way to non-invasively spot a biomarker that could tell us whether somebody's heading the wrong way. Now, as far as some other things that are a challenge for us right now that athletes are buying into, is certainly the idea of trying to train on a very low carbohydrate feed rate, well below what it is that what we would consider the lowest intensity carb feed rates, in an effort to be efficient at burning fat and sparing glycogen. The only problem is, if you're in a power sport, you may adapt along the way and really minimize your ability to do high quality power work. So the pyruvate dehydrogenase story is one that's saying, hey, look, you might be a more efficient fat mobilizer, but if you can't do the burst work that kept you on the roster, what did you achieve? And so that's something where we're sitting back watching it. Ketogenic is a lot more drastic. We're talking about less than 50 calories of grams of carbohydrate feed rate per day. Just a couple slices of bread, a small piece of fruit, and a lactose in a cup of milk would put you at your threshold for the day. It's a very low carbohydrate feed rate. And if you do super slow sub-maximal intensity work, maybe being keto adapted is okay. I'm not sure it is from the microbiome standpoint, but from the work standpoint, maybe it's going to work for some people. But if there is a power element to your sport, they're going to have to prove to us that you can do both, that you can be keto adapted and be an explosive athlete. Even if you're an endurance athlete, you come up to a hill, or you're trying to pass people, or you're trying to sprint to the finish line. If you can't muster up the power to do that because of the fuel substrate you've adapted to, then what did you achieve? So certainly we're just watching. We're sitting back watching this. Certainly the ultra endurance community out there has got some people adhering to the very low carb and keto world. Yet when we read reports about what it is that they're consuming along the way, it's certainly not the majority. Most people they just eat whatever they can get down the hatch. It's got a lot of calorie density to it, and that can keep them moving on these long, exhaustive trails. If you want to follow that research, Jeff Volek, Stephen Finney are at the top of the food chain there. They're probably going to do their best work with diabetic populations and ketogenic diets, more so than athletic populations, but where it does potentially work, they're documenting it in that ultra endurance population. So that was a lot to throw at you pretty quick, but I think we're about right on the threshold of where I want to pull the reins back and take some questions. And just FYI, the Ag Nutrition Center will have some of those posters available to you, any of you that are going to the ACSM Summit in San Diego, April 6th through 9th. And outside of that, we'll have to figure something out. But at this point, why don't we open it up for questions?
All right, thank you so much. I have a couple of questions that I see that have appeared here, so I'll just go ahead and ask you a few of those. At the beginning of your presentation, you mentioned the need for stronger NCAA doping control. Can you comment on what immediate and long-term steps do you think need to be taken to address this issue?
Well, I think it just starts out as communication. I actually brought this up to the folks from the NC2A in a meeting that we were all speaking at recently. And when we have rookies go into Major League Baseball or NFL or MLB or NBA, a lot of times they'll test positive and they'll turn around and say, geez, I went all the way through college and I never had a problem, and it was a dietary supplement that they said they were using through college. And so it's really a budget issue in college, really, as far as the frequency and the quality of testing that would start to spot problems sooner rather than later. I think what they can do right now is turn around and have a good dialogue with the pro ranks as to what they're seeing with these incoming rookie classes, and then go backwards and see if there's something they could do to spot these problems earlier in the collegiate populations. But Brian Hainline and John Parsons and Mary Weaver, all the good folks at the NC2A, well, they know that at the end of the day, it's just really more of a budget challenge than it is a will to do something.
Okay, thanks. Here's another question. If an athlete has insufficient levels of a nutrient in the body, such as vitamin D, do you recommend immediate supplementation or first changes in their daily food intake, or both simultaneously?
Yeah, it'd probably be both, but at the end of the day, seasonally, sports like basketball, hockey, competing indoors, the days are shorter, their sun exposures are terrible. We're not going to screw around there. We're going to have to get those vitamin D levels up quickly, and so certainly we're going to find an NSF certified source of vitamin D. And I've seen data in NBA teams where when an athlete dropped off their vitamin D protocols, we've seen cortisol go up and testosterone drop. So there's a lot at play there with regard to vitamin D, and there's a growing story on vulnerability for injuries. There's always been an immune story there. It's just not something you want to flirt with, and that you need to resolve it once you've identified an insufficiency or deficiency.
Okay, thank you. During your presentation, you discussed the importance of obtaining protein several times post-workout. And you mentioned a little bit about the sources of protein and leucine in particular being important. Can you just comment, I guess, for the general athlete, is it more important to focus on particular sources or just trying to get all of their essential amino acids in post-workout?
Well, I think I coach diversity of protein sources between animal, dairy, and vegan sources. From a nutrient standpoint, there's, iron in the red meat, and there's calcium in the dairy sources. There's all kinds of unique attributes that come with vegan proteins. Some digest fast, some digest slow, so you get a little bit of a timed release, short-term to longer, more area under the curve story with a diversified protein intake. So at mealtime, it's a protein diversity story, and I think that when you get down to those between meal minimum protein intakes, whether they're snacks or incidental to workouts, and post-workout recovery protein source, let's say, the quality becomes a bigger issue, and that's where I'm going to really zero in on those highest leucine yielding protein sources that we are very typical of functional foods and dietary supplements. But I got to be clear, protein by itself is a food. It's, until you fashion it into a finished product where maybe it's been fortified with individual amino acids or an herbal something or a real high vitamin mineral feed rate, does it protein become a supplement? So it gets a little confusing to consumers. And I'll tell you, athletes get tired of pills and powders. When you start working with veteran athletes that have been around for a while, they would much rather walk over to the salad bar and pick out their favorite fruit, for the flavor system, and come back over and let you build, a protein source into it for them. But as far as that same tired, ready to drink off the shelf protein source, they've had so many of those in their life that a food form delivery is really what they're after. So we always are using food. If the players come in from a hard workout, we might have any number of protein snacks available. They might be in certainly the shake form, a bar form. They might be in a deviled eggs, you name it. We put all kinds of foods out that fit the bill for protein.
Okay, great. Thank you so much. Well, thank you, Dave, for a great presentation. On behalf of ACSM and ENC, or Egg Nutrition Center, we want to thank everybody for attending today's seminar and or webinar. This concludes the webinar.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Cooper, Dave, for the presentation. Just a quick reminder, too, for everyone that an email will be sent out here in the next 3 or 4 days with a link to the CEC, as well as a recorded version of the webinar, in addition to a PDF of the slides that Dave presented today. So look for that email in the next couple of days. Again, thanks for everyone's attention, and have a great afternoon.